The NFLPA and NFL owners and executives have officially agreed on how salary cap deficits will be handled for the NFL season in 2020 and beyond. Hello, everybody. This is Austin with the Bare Necessities, and today we're going to be talking about how this is going to affect the NFL and the hometown Chicago Bears. The agreement that the NFL and NFLPA came to outlines a plan for how the NFL is going to handle the salary cap deficit that was predicted due to the Covid-19 outbreak. Of course, with no fans being in the seats and also just economic damages all across the United States, the NFL is expecting to have first loss in revenue for a long time. And now this is a very complicated issue because most NFL GMs count on a $10 million increase to the salary cap each year. Initial reports were claiming that the NFL owners and executives were considering trying to take a salary cap cut this year and spreading it out over multiple years in the future. However, that hasn't really turned out to be the case. So first, let's go over the exact specifications as to what this agreement that the NFL and NFLPA has came to. So first off, the salary cap this year is going to stay exactly the same. There's going to be no changes, so no worries as to veteran players being cut this year. The NFL and NFLPA also agreed in this document to a minimum salary cap next year, that being $175 million. Now, for those of you who do not know exactly how much that is, that's actually a $24 million cut to the salary cap this year. And then after that, any further financial deficits caused by coronavirus will be spread out over the next 4 years, come 2025. Now, as far as my initial reactions go to this conclusion, it's not a horrible one. I'm happy that we didn't do any salary cap changes to this year because it would have really caused some uproar as far as players who had to have been cut. And I'm also happy that the NFL made the decision to spread across the damages and not just have them all impacted next year, because that could have been detrimental to almost every single NFL team and a complete restructure as to which players are where in the next coming seasons. So ultimately, this is not a bad conclusion. Unfortunately, there really was no way to avoid the damage of the coronavirus completely as far as impacting how our teams look. However, this agreement should at least help minimize some of the implications of this in the near future. Also, it's important to remember that since salary cap does increase exponentially every single year, and earnings do increase every single year, that likely after the coronavirus is completely gotten rid of, the actual salary cap numbers beyond 2021 will likely not be that great of a fall because they should be offset by some initial gains to the salary cap in future years. So really, what does this mean for the entire NFL? Well, many teams are going to need to go into next offseason completely rethinking the way that they have their teams. I mean, a $24 million cut where some teams were expecting to be right at the salary cap limits, it's obviously going to have some substantial impacts on how teams are structured. However, again, this is not the worst case scenario as this would have already happened. It's just we have to deal with this evil regardless of what occurs. And again, I talked about how the NFL continuously structures deals more heavily loaded in the future to accommodate for the increases that we've seen every single year from NFL salary cap. One important point that I believe is important to note for those of you who do not understand salary cap just as much as other people, salary cap is driven by a percentage of how much league revenue is earned in the previous season. So as league revenue increases, so does salary cap. And unfortunately, that leaves salary cap up to being altered by economic statuses. So let me just kind of reiterate what I was saying before. It's that we had to face this evil regardless of what happened, and this plan is just kind of trying to mitigate some of the damages. So what exactly does this mean for the Chicago Bears, which is obviously the team that I cover the most and the team that most of you come and join me for? Well, the Bears currently have $24 million in salary cap space going into 2021, meaning that the Bears would effectively, if the league actually does have to implement the $24 million loss, which I expect to happen, the Bears would have zero cap space. And that's unfortunate because we have free agents like Allen Robinson and potentially Mitchell Trubisky, who will likely end up walking in the future. But again, Allen Robinson, he's going to need a big contract. How are we going to give it to him? Well, unfortunately, to draw up that cap space, we're going to have to make some close cuts, and we're really going to have to evaluate every single player's worth to the team. So guys like, in my eyes, Jimmy Graham, which I think is undoubtedly one of the first people we would look to cut. And then even guys like Kyle Fuller, who are going to be taking up $20 million of cap next year, they will probably be finding new homes going into next season. Obviously, Jimmy Graham will likely probably be cut, whereas Kyle Fuller would likely be traded. That being said, there's also a chance that these guys would take pay cuts, and ultimately we will have to cut nobody. And again, there's a little bit of an offsetting effect there where free agency contracts are going to become cheaper, and many guys will likely take pay cuts to either stay with their team or help accommodate the team's disadvantages. But again, the more outstanding impact is that NFL teams will, regardless of pay cuts, regardless of free agency contracts, likely be dealing with a difficult economic situation for their team. So unfortunately, the Bears will not have a lot of cap space as we expected they might have in 2021. I know that it was the big cap relief time that we were expecting, but that does not look like it is going to happen unless we make some major changes to our roster. On the bright side, if the Chicago Bears are considering moving on from some pieces and trying to do maybe a slight retool, slight rebuild, this is not a bad time to do so, rather than trying to go all in with a roster that you don't feel confident about. So ultimately, it's not the greatest thing for the Bears, but there's definitely going to be many other teams who are impacted far worse than the Chicago Bears. Teams like Kansas City and the Los Angeles Rams will likely have much more difficult situations than we will. So at the end of the day, it's unfortunate that this is occurring, but the NFL did make a responsible decision in actually coming out and creating these salary cap saving procedures rather than just sitting on their hands and waiting for it to be fully actualized next offseason. One final note of potential positivity is that Allen Robinson might actually find himself getting a contract extension fairly shortly. Now the Bears actually have a true representation of what the NFL salary cap is going to look like in 2021, so it makes a lot more sense as to why they would potentially give him a extension now. Hey guys, like our video, subscribe, and check out our bi-weekly podcasts on Apple Podcasts. Thanks.